Hello and welcome to Demo Thursday with Skyport Systems. Today we have a special session. We're going to dig into identity management. And we've actually brought one of our industry luminaries in identity management to join us to actually talk a little bit more about what ID management really means, why this is larger than authentication, and what really are the best practices in securely deploying and protecting these systems. So I'd like to introduce Garrett Grajak. Garrett, you've been involved in the identity management space for quite a while. Do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of what your background is in identity management and specifically some of the types of clients you've been working with and some of the identity management architectures you've been involved with?
Absolutely, Dan, and thanks for having me on. This is a great series you have. I've been in identity management almost my whole career. Started as a programmer, but came on early as a SE over at a company called Security Dynamics. And people are scratching their head, why is he bringing up that? Security Dynamics made those wonderful two-factor tokens, and it became RSA. And that basically got me very, very interested in identities and authenticating the identities and associated identities to applications. From there, I went on to various firms, Integrity, SiteMinder for SSO, IBM, Cisco, created my own two-factor company, SecureAuth, which we have an XSE on it, is also Milton on here. But what's relevant is now, that today, is taking that architecture that I once was just deploying at RSA, which we had just your directory and then an authentication mechanism and then giving you application access. Where is that today, 20 years later? Well, that's what we're going to talk about here. What is the infrastructure of today? What are the devices today? And what are the challenges in providing access, authorization, and of course auditing as well to all these resources? All the best.
Thanks, Garrett. And I'd also like to introduce Milton Keith. Milton Keith also works for Skyport Systems. He's one of our identity management subject matter experts based down in Texas. And Milton will be actually walking through a demonstration of SkySecure actually protecting these key identity management systems. So welcome, Keith. Welcome, Milton. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Garrett.
So let's start off and talk a little bit about identity management in general. So at Skyport, we're delivering the most secure way to deploy and manage critical applications. And as we start looking at identity management, this is one of the cornerstones of today's enterprise. As enterprises are going increasingly towards supporting hybrid cloud applications, there's a key glue that actually ties these together. As a user, you normally think of this as a user login and a single sign-on system. When this works, you never know it's there. But if you start looking at the architecture itself and understanding the risk of what this is actually delivering to your organization, you can start seeing all the different systems that are really tied into this authentication system and the larger identity management scope. Now, I've always been an infrastructure guy. I tend to think of this as something like Active Directory, where you establish and authenticate user accounts. And you see connectors for things like infrastructure, especially network infrastructure for the Radius and TAC+. But today it's starting to extend into other systems. This could be virtualization systems, your vCenter system that's natively tied into Active Directory for user authentication. You're also starting to see single sign-on systems tied to enterprise applications, ERP applications. But today, as we move towards hybrid cloud, the threat model gets even larger. It's not just inside the firewall. We're now able to start tying in authentication and also the larger sphere of identity to external services that are now becoming part of this hybrid cloud. So as we really look at this, this is what we see as the number one thing to look at in terms of securing your entire enterprise. It's this authentication and identity chain. And in the end, this is why this matters. If you look at the breaches that have occurred in the last 2 years, a large number of them are actually centered around identity management breaches. Now, to secure this, it's not just securely architecting the identity management system, it's covering the threat surface of these applications. And we're going to talk more with Garrett about how do we correctly architect these, but also how do we deploy these in a secure environment. And fundamentally, this is the type of threat surface that we're looking at. Your identity management systems really are first-class applications inside your environment. if you treat these as a standard application mixed in with general purpose compute, there's actually a whole series of threats where you can actually create privilege escalation and start to compromise that identity management through the actual infrastructure these systems are running on. We're going to be telling you a little bit more about this today. So Garrett, as we start looking at identity management, as an infrastructure guy, I've always thought of this as Active Directory, maybe some authentication connectors and two-factor authentication. Why is identity management really bigger than just the authentication system? Like what really is in identity management as an architecture?
Dan, I really like where you took that. I was taking notes when you started this, and I like that. It is for outsiders who come new to identity management or start struggling with it, they do. They see there's a concrete. Garrett, it's pretty obvious. I got a username, I got a password, I got some groups, and I put that in some directory. Yeah, that's true. But look at that slide that we had a couple of goes ago. We had the directory on the left, and then we had the resources going out. Okay? Now that's really where identity management today. It is an ephemeral problem. That is, yes, we have a static ID somewhere, but via the miracles of authentication, it is turned into an ephemeral session, and that's what's brought into this resource, be it the on-premise applications, be it the cloud applications that you're hosting in your infrastructure as a service and your IaaS platforms, into the SaaS, which is your Google apps and your Office 365 and Concur, and into your mobile apps. Some mechanisms have to be in place to take the logical ID and then turn it into an ephemeral session ID. And that's what we're going to focus on this discussion, is there's a lot of components in that. And this slide is talking to it as well, that yes, there is a directory, and yes, that is what gets you into that those bubble slides. It's still only the identities. But there is a lot of hacking being done today to grab the identities in all these various components that enable someone to look at the application that comes from the cloud, or enable a device such as a mobile device to access information or an application. These applications and these resources, beyond just the Active Directory, and we'll label them and talk about them and talk about what they do, these have to be secured in the same manner that we now have regulations, PCI, DSS, and the others, about how information has to be stored, how it has to be encrypted, etc. But we'll see, this slide is perfect, Dan. Look at all of these components. We can start at the bottom. All of these components that are involved in modern identity. You want me, Dan, to take some time and talk about this?
Yeah, let's dive into these. And before we do that, we had a conversation earlier as we were preparing for the webcast, where you really gave me a really interesting just understanding of what identity management means. It's more than just a username and a password in a session. Identity management also encompasses who that user is and what their role is. And
absolutely.
And the risk is actually more than just compromising the ID. Can you tell me more about that? Because this is the part that if I always thought about it as authentication, I was missing the bigger picture of why this matters.
Thanks for organizing my thoughts. 100%. Identity is Garrett Grajak to Skyport Systems is a partner. Great. I get to see this resource and this resource, right? Garrett Grajak to OSC is CEO. I should see these systems and these systems. And that is a great point, Dan, because what hackers are doing today is they're taking identities and then escalating them, escalating their privileges beyond what they should have access to. The whole concept here, and the concept you'll see always written up, is GRE and attestation. Why does an identity have certain privileges? And if he does have those privileges, how do they get authorized to those privileges, and what is the mechanisms that you use? These are a lot of these components you'll see, and each one of these is retaining some type of the identity, either in a cache form or in a long-term storage form. So let me repeat, identity is not just what's stored in the directory, it is the authorization privileges to the various resources that you have. And once upon a time, that was really simple. When I started my career, Garrett, it's pretty obvious. We got a directory, we got an Oracle app, and I got a VPN that then they log in and they get the L3 access and they run the Oracle app. Rock and roll. Now that user has his identity, but has privileges all over the place. Yes, Garrett, he has his directory to the VPN, but he also has these legacy apps. But Garrett, he also has these apps that are on the mobile, and she only see this much content because this is his role. And oh yeah, we got these SaaS tools and we got these servers out there. Now, if he's in the sales group, he sees these. If he's in the management group, he sees these. If he's in the partner group, he sees these. That's real identity management. Categorizing, classifying, and determining what users have what, and then doing the hard stuff, which is attesting why that user have access and what access are we granting them.
So that's really interesting. What really clarified this in my head is when I started realizing that in an organization, it's roles, not people, that actually create business process. And an example of this is there's already a significant amount of fraud, even conducted over email, where somebody will impersonate a CEO. I'm sure you have already experienced this. It's pretty rampant, Garrett, where somebody will impersonate an email from the CEO and send it to the CFO saying, hey, we need to make this payment. And it's an out-of-band communication. You don't actually see that the CEO is asking you for this. Well, if you extend this logic, what you actually now have is in an ERP system, you have a role of somebody like a CEO that says, go do this, which could be something as tangible as transfer assets for the organization. And if you're able to compromise the identity, then the entire system is designed around that permission, around the identity. So somebody who can compromise this can actually do things like move assets and instruct other parts of the business to do real business actions that could engender real financial risk. And that's sort of what I started thinking about as we had this discussion, why this role really matters. Is this something that you've seen as you engage with your customers that you normally tend to highlight?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a whole business around saying, great, I have an ID. Now, how do what is my process for classification? That is actually a manual process. That's something involved in now of saying, great, we have to establish a process on what humans are, what roles they get, and then what do the roles actually have resources to. If it is misclassified, yes, data may be leaked out, but more relevantly, access, literally access, could be jumped and hurdled. Classic case to me was that the Target hack. The Target hack, if you go back and look at that, and this poor guy's not going to pick them out, and that bubble slide shows that there's lots of victims out there, but that one has been identified well. Those were unauthorized users going through the HVAC system, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. Now, what they were able to do is get credentials and jump on that system. Now, watch where I'm going with this, audience. Okay, that's bad. Yeah, they shouldn't have got the credentials. They shouldn't have got into the HVAC system. What was really, though, bad is that users with that level of access were able to get on servers that were able to pull data and extract PII of users. That's the type of stuff that needs to be addressed in identity. Not only, of course, we have to do strong caching of hashing of the password, and we should, use two-factor where enabled and all that. But once we establish that, we should also put in firewalls, mental firewalls, and logical firewalls around the application that the applications that silos out these resources. An HVAC user shouldn't be able to get into data, etc. Yes, I'll bring up some other examples as we go along.
Perfect. Well, and as we discussed this, I mean, the risk is sort of clear. And PII, I think your quote from when we spoke before was probably the best one. PII, personally identifiable information, is the gift that keeps on giving. Once you have it, you can leverage that so much more access. So if we look at architecturally, how do we solve this problem? We understand the risk of not only authentication, but identity in general. It seems like there's really two parts to securely architecting this. One of these is an architectural discussion, we're looking at sort of an ecosystem. And the first thing that jumps out at me here is just how much this ecosystem has grown over the years. There's so many components involved in actually establishing and testing and managing this identity. Do you want to walk through we'll start off with sort of how we establish general identity and what some of these components do and why they're important to this architecture, and maybe even an example of how a user would flow through to either an IaaS application or a software as a service application that we've federated in.
Perfect. So let's start at the bottom. Let's start talking about identities. And first of all, it says Active Directory there. That's our directory. And that itself, there's a lot of work in consolidating, because we all know in groups are enterprises are a merger, a confluence of different groups, different enterprises, different departments, M&A, all that type of stuff, right? So your Active Directory itself is a identity project and probably does need to be consolidated. And what I mean by that is, where is the authorization rule? Well, Garrett, you have to understand, for this application, I use the directory and I use that group, but I actually have this other internal database that is doing the authorization. Stuff like that needs to be looked at, because that is all in the world of hacking. It's about A2P, advanced persistent threats, where what you can do is you look for the weakest point and then attack it. So if you're keeping identity and authorization information all over the place, that's one of the best practices. We should look at consolidating. Now, let's go from we'll go left to right on this. Identity attestation, that's the concept of, okay, I'm provisioning rights, I'm provisioning access, I'm provisioning authorization through some type of mechanism. It could be as evil as spreadsheets, or it could be a really nice identity provisioning system. Okay, why is that being done, and what is the current state of any user, of any group, of any app? Now, something I want to say about this is, not only is that a process, and there's wonderful tools out there, be it the Oracle products, the SailPoint products, the Empower IDs, etc., but what we also have to do is make sure what is the access to those products themselves, right? If you have root access into those products themselves, they're also often tied into provisioning, you can do exactly what Dan just talked about, which is not only create a user or take a user, just go on the website, right? Create a blog user, right? And then escalate yourself. Very, very dangerous. And I'm sorry, the slide change. Should we go back to the architecture slide? Here we go. Now, let's just move left to right. Pam, privilege identity management, or privilege access management. That's your like your Lieberman software, etc. Very, very relevant stuff. If you go to that bubble slide, and we'll give you these things, and you take a look at where the hacks are, what a lot of this stuff is people getting on to the servers. Yeah, that one. Be it the Anthem, be it eBay, or be it even Sony, where they lost a lot of their videos, getting onto servers and getting root or admin passwords, and then doing nefarious things from there. That's really, really important. How have you locked down your privilege access management tool, and how have you locked down your IDs, and what is the process that you are using for giving access to that system and to the other systems? This is something that has to always be looked at, because this is where most of the hacks are coming from. A good slide to help me be organize thoughts in a more logical way. In this regards, we got the directory, you got the privilege access management, but look at the second and third one, SSO and network access. Okay, when I started my access identity career, all access was network access. That's how you had those thick apps get out to the remote users. That, of course, the importance of it hasn't changed. As I brought up our poor friends at Target, that was a network access breach. Okay, that's got to be locked down. Who are we giving network access to? And when I'm doing my shows and my discussions, I'm real big on saying I don't think as many users should be getting network access. And we do see a lot and other solutions. Network access should be limited to trusted users that actually need, well, network access. If you're deploying apps through a network, that's something that should be looked at, because there are really good tools now that will give the resource information. The bullet right above network access is SSO. That's where I see a lot of intelligence being done, not just for ease of use to users, and that certainly helps get the budget approved, but for the actual security of your enterprise, right? If I can say, watch, just examples in my head right now, the Target example. Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to give you network access to read the HVAC information, why wouldn't I just create a website with an authentication, and then I would have some apps that those particular users would see. And therefore, they would never have network access. And that's all about SSO, e.g. establishing an identity, usually at the layer 7 level, which is the web level, and then giving SSO to web apps, either internal or the wonderful SaaS apps, external. Okay, I'll stay on this slide, and then watch where we're going to the purple levels. Now we just left the enterprise, and now we're doing identity enforcement. Yeah, I talked about PAMs for the servers, but what is your authentication systems? Think about that, right? And that goes hand in hand with your SSO system. What is your authentication system? Well, Garrett, I got username, password, and I got secure ID for my external users. All right, but what about the people who get into SaaS app? What about your partners who get into your sales information? What about your partners that you give access to for helping you audit your enterprise, et cetera? There's various forms of two-factor right now, and that should map to not only to your security practices around the information that you identify, but also the regulatory procedures. Very strong rules, of course, around PCI DSS for the retail. Very changing rules right now for HIPAA, okay? Now, great, you were able to get PHI information with the strong passwords. HIPAA 3 is talking about using stronger two-factor. Okay, now we get into the, and I'll pause, Dan.
Yeah, so Garrett, you actually brought up something interesting, not only as we go through these different authentication systems, but as we were talking about some of the architecture. What we look at in terms of how tightly coupled these different systems are and how interconnected these systems are, there's some interesting risks around it. It's not just risk of breach. I think there's two things that we want to look at. One is how do we actually lock down these systems, and we'll have a discussion about that. But there's also an architectural concern over how identity flows and even how things are replicated. You mentioned something about ghost accounts as we talked about that. Do you want to cover why that's important, especially as we start linking these systems together?
Brilliant. Okay, so there's some really important. So we got information. I've got these apps in my upper left-hand corner in my AWS because I got some servers and apartments. I've got some apps, of course, I'm using in the SaaS services, my Google, my Microsoft, and then I've got 15 different web apps and thick apps that I'm using. Okay, what has often happened, Dan, in the enterprise, and Milton was a director of infrastructure, he knows this, what happened is people do quick remedies. Well, it's really easy. What I did is I wrote this real quick syncing program. I'm syncing the data over here, and then my application now is able to read it, and I'm able to authenticate and utilize my users. All right, what you just did is created a security hack, a security vulnerability, because now you replicated data, and as Dad said, you got to watch how that data is being transmitted. It's being transmitted in the clear. Is it easy to just put a trace on that and then download all the packets? And if you're transferring files, all right, how is that being stored on the new server, right? And how is that being encrypted on the new server? follow Minecraft because I have a son like everyone else does, or a kid that plays Minecraft. And that was hacked, and they took 7 million users of that on a lightly encrypted username password file. Okay, so that gets posted to the dark web, and someone just says, "Okay, rock and roll, dude. I randomly shared servers. Here's the username passwords." It's done all the time. So as Dan stated, it's not just the one directory. What we have to look at our system is where is this directory been replicated, and what are the protection mechanisms on that? And that's why, like in this below, is we shouldn't be replicating data. We should be using the tools like SSO Federation and those mechanisms, both internal and external, instead of replicating data. Provisioning is a part of our identity lifecycle. There's no question of that. We have to have an attestable process to take an identity and then push it into resources. But during that process, we should discover, we should look at it and go, wow, why am I doing this? Why am I pushing out this identity to 6 different databases, where 3 of them I don't really even have that much control over? Isn't there a better way to do this? And yes, you provision, you look at that and say, what I'll do is I will create an SSO Federation system where I can authenticate once and then push out the identity in an ephemeral way, which is a session ticket, which is much, much more secure than actually taking a 7 million user database file and giving it to another resource.
That makes perfect sense, Garrett. So it really sounds like this is where the architecture comes in towards actually architecting a secure identity management system. It's actually understanding how authentication flows, how systems are linked online in real time, and how these trust dependencies are set up. Is this generally how you approach this when you work with your customers on these identity management architectures?
100%. And this is what we came up together, and I like this. This slide helps organize my thoughts. What you do is, first of all, let's come up with what users and what our user store will be, so we can all agree upon this and watch how it works from there. And watch where I'm going with this, team. This could be your legacy directory on-premise, which certainly should be locked down, or it could be some servers you have in the cloud, be it a wonderful private cloud, be it the AWS, Azure, Google, or some other private cloud. Or this could even be, in the smaller enterprises, a SaaS repository, be it Azure, Google, etc. But let's focus and see how much we can do with just one identity. From there, put on a process cognitive data identity provisioning system, where if I take on a new user, I can quantify that user, classify them as a role, and then push that identity into the data store. And if I'm doing this right, if I put him in a role, he should automatically have access via components number 3 and 4. Yes, there's going to be some data syncing, but if that's coupled with a system of identity federation, where what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say I will federate the user via an ephemeral layer 7 mechanism of authentication and then transfer an ID to that user during application runtime. And that's what I should have stated about 20 minutes ago. The right way to do identity is to pass the identity in application runtime, as opposed to putting a solid object into another person's repository. And that's where the hacks are coming in, where I replicate 7 million users, like our friends at Minecraft did, into a weaker database, and voila, now I'm being hacked. So let's go through the first 4, and then the next 2 make sense. Create a data store record that y'all can agree on, that you're going to that you can secure and lock down with not only procedures but infrastructure components that actually make sense, and that's where Skyport Systems are masters of. But also then come up with a identity provisioning and identity syncing system that makes sense, that if you can write this down and create procedures like we do at OSC, we say this is where I'm pushing the data, fine, this makes sense, and I try to eliminate as many of those data provisioning via a Federation SSO system, which is secured via a strong two-factor where relevant. And two-factor is hand in hand with SSO. And watch this, and I kind of made a living of this for 10 years of my life, is the better your SSO system, the stronger your multi-factor system can be. You won't have a user revolution if, okay, I'm going to authenticate you 3 ways, but I'm going to give you access to your 15 servers. You're never going to have to authenticate again. But if I'm dropping that user session each time and reestablishing them and making them put even something as lowly as a painful password every time, you're going to get pushback. And all of this has to work in the mobile environment. And once again, as technologists, we're going to be all this on this call and probably the other side as well. Mobile is actually a kind of a neat advantage. You get to cheat a little, and I mean that. It's a whole other topic. But mobile is actually easier than the other platforms because people are accustomed to installing apps. And apps you can do pretty secure. You should be looking at that. And that's what we've been doing a lot of OSC, is you can put relevant keys in there and you can do wallets, etc., that help identify the user. And there's a lot of real fun stuff going on in that space, everything from traditional PKI wallets to the more advanced and modern blockchain wallets, all based on keys and client-to-server validation. Okay, thanks.
So Garrett, this really highlights why this is such an architectural issue. So I mean, there does need to be an architectural approach to this. There's also another important question that I think our audience needs to know, which is, as we look at the architecture, like where does the rubber meet the road? Like as you actually go implement this, how do you make this into reality? I want to throw this over to Milton. I mean, Milton, you've spent years actually implementing these systems at customer sites. Do you want to talk about sort of what matters when you take this architecture and actually apply it to an enterprise problem set?
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Garrett. As Dan and Garrett mentioned, I've spent years working in the multi-factor space and also one of the leading identities access service platform vendors out there for single sign-on. Prior to that, I was a director of infrastructure and also chief information security officer. What's important is you need to look at the platform these run on. A lot of these products you see out there, they're really hyper-focused and do what they do very well. But then when it comes to the audit and accountability of these systems, that's where you see some weaknesses. Some are really strong, some are quite surprisingly weak on it for being security companies. When we saw that bubble slide, one of them, there was a bank mention on it. They actually had to cart out around 90 servers out of their data center because the hackers got in, and once they got in, they actually infected the firmware. So once a hacker is able to establish control of the firmware on these servers, then that's it. Game's over. It's hard to clean up after that and remediate. It's even very hard to detect. McAfee reported in their last year's report they're seeing more and more firmware attacks, which I always find this amazing because in the early 90s I was in the military, and the first virus I ever had to deal with was the anti-CMOS virus. And since then you saw the self-replicating worms, but now we're starting to see hackers go back down to the firmware layer. And that's where Skyport comes in, where we provide this tamper-resistant platform. And I'm going to hand it back to Dan to explain about how we protect at the firmware layer, and then we'll get into a demo and show you how easy it is to set this up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Milton. And I think this is really key. And as we look at identity management and also securing these critical systems, it's both an architectural approach and it's a platform solution. And that's really why we're excited to be able to work with people like OSC and Garrett on this problem. So fundamentally, what we allow you to do is take a lot of the platform concerns off the table. So you can spend more of your time and effort on the architectural approach of how you're building in the identity management into your application architecture and your overall enterprise scope. So ultimately, this is what SkySecure brings to the table. Is if you look at the overall threat vectors, how do we address these from an architectural point of view, which is part of how you deploy these systems and how you architect the actual flow of identity, but then how do you implement these on a secure platform so that you can actually cover the threat surface of the application underneath? And this is really what Skyport is all about. We build a platform that allows you to take concerns over things like firmware and malware infections, and even clean source for the platforms that need to run these identity management systems, and take that off the table. We build an environment directly around these systems so that now you can place not only the critical controls that you need around applications like SSO Federation, Active Directory, identity attestation systems, even things like mobile gateways that are a key part of the identity management infrastructure, and not only protect these, but run it on a trusted platform. The other thing that's key here is architecturally, as we look at identity management, this is an end-to-end application tie inside your enterprise. This is more important than typical enterprise applications. So being able to manage this as a first-class application is really key to be able to deliver that security model. And this is what Skyport brings to the table is two things. The ability to easily import your existing identity management components into an architecture where we can provide the type of protection that your best practices from deploying these systems would require, locking down the systems, providing that they're free from compromise at a hardware or firmware level, and then also be able to start to give application layer control, start to lock down. How do you know, for instance, that that SSO Federation server is actually only talking to the right components, that it's not establishing any unauthorized connections, that unauthorized users are not able to compromise that system, or that malware cannot actually interfere with that system and start to create a compromise in the underlying operating system. And then finally, giving you the visibility of what these critical systems are doing so that you can keep control and understand exactly what security posture you have. And fundamentally, this is what SkySecure gives you, is a turnkey way of deploying and managing all of these systems that Garrett, Milton, and I have been talking about in a contiguous environment where you have assurance that it's a known good, trusted platform with clean source. You can run it from one location. You can maintain full control over all these interlinked components, and you can do it regardless of where they're located. It could be in your data center, in your DMZ, or even at a remote site where we can give you a secure way to manage all of these components so you could actually keep the identity management glue together. And this is really what Skyport brings to the table. Now, Garrett, before we get into the demo, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of where you see some of these components live, and as you look past the initial architecture, what are some of the best practices that you normally recommend for actually locking down these services? It's more important than just installing AD. How do you actually protect it?
Yeah, exactly. I like this chart because what it shows is where the identity is in all of these systems for the access control we want on the mobile and the cloud. Yes, it's in the AD, but it's also the identity is being managed and changed, and the authorization in the PAM system below, and in the radius and the TAC system for the network is controlled, and in the two-factor systems, and in the provisioning systems. Each one of those machines should be locked down for what? To make sure who has access, to make sure what the authorization is, how much access control does each person have. There should be delegated, should be a master user, and then there should be sub-admins underneath that for each one of these services. And what is the security around the actual component itself, right? If you have all these things have some type of embedded web interface, etc. If they have unpatched and unmanaged machines, right, they might be vulnerable to all types of hacks on the form page itself. Anything from cross-site scripting to the Heartbleed, etc. if they're not updated. That's why each one of those servers needs to be looked at. And then you move out to the ADs and the LDAPs and the other infrastructure as a service clouds and the federation components and the other components like your CASBs, which is controlling access to your different cloud and SaaS performance, cloud access security brokers. Each one of these systems needs to be analyzed over how their infrastructure, how they're secured, and who has access to them, and what is the authorization and how much management power each user is getting at the end. Finally, the topography, your identity topography should stand out to your partners and affiliates, because if they're sharing data and they're using data inappropriately, you might be in trouble yourself. That was literally a hack that I put up on LinkedIn 2 days ago that Google, who's an amazing cloud company, has amazing procedures, and I'm not going to say that they were hacked, but that what happened was an employee list of information was shared with a third party who then inappropriately used that file, and then identity information was taken from them. So that was a hack that was conducted against, that could have been conducted against Google employees because information was shared to a third party. So our process and procedures around identities have to not only be around the identities that we store and use in our own systems, but what were shared with the partners.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Garrett. And I think as we start looking at what it takes to lock down these systems, what surprises me the most is as you actually read through the recommendations, every one of these systems comes from a vendor that gives you very solid recommendations for locking it down. Microsoft just published one a few months ago, their latest guide for securing Active Directory. It's 288 pages. And a lot of what it's telling you to do is extremely logical, but it covers, I mean, it's basically like a CISSP test. I mean, it covers everything from physical security all the way up to logical application design. But what strikes me is how much of this is actually best practice for locking down any system that sounds easy to describe. Things like know that you're running on a trusted platform. Know that you isolate where administrators are actually allowed to log into the systems. You can keep control of these credentials. Even physically isolating domain admin workstations. This kind of stuff it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but it's not always practical to do. One of the things we'd like to show you, and I'm going to throw it over to Milton here, so that we can take a look at why it's important to be able to provide these types of protections, not just for Active Directory, but each one of these critical components for identity management, but be able to make these things that are typically hard to architect simple and easy to deploy. Milton, do you want to walk us through what this looks like inside of SkySecure?
Yes, thank you, Dan, and great stuff, Garrett. So as Dan was talking about, each of these vendors out there, specifically like Microsoft, gave you a 280-page detailed document on best practices. One of the concepts they're talking about is your segmentation. Traditionally today, what you see in the enterprises, when they do segmentation, they're doing it either at layer 3 via firewalls, or they're doing it at layer 2 via VLANs. The problem is you still have that lateral movement. Once an attacker can get one system, they can laterally move to the next system. Even in traditional virtual environments, from a guest OS, you see it every year at Black Hat, they hack up into the host virtual system, and then because there's shared resources, they can compromise the other guest virtual machines on that device. This is where SkySecure is completely different. We've created a brand new way of doing platform security. Our founders, most of them came from Cisco and Juniper, and what they always said is, we build these secure networks, and then we start adding the security pieces as add-on, individual pieces to the network afterwards. So they wanted to create a product where security is at the core at the very beginning of the architecture without compromising the performance to the applications. So what you see right here is the home page of the SkySecure Center. This is where you can centrally manage all your SkySecure servers. And as Dan was talking about with the firmware protection, we actually attest our servers. So if I click right here on this one SkySecure server, what you're going to see when I look at the attestation, we have these various PCRs. We know from manufacturing exactly what firmware and what software in our BIOS, CMOS is running on our systems, even in the solid-state drives. And we do this dual attestation on our platform, and we will not boot if something's been tampered with. Now, you don't have to know what all these settings mean. Just know that the attestation is valid and hasn't been compromised. Now, getting back to the home system, you can see the virtual, how many CPUs you have. With traditional hypervisors, you have shared CPU resources. With SkySecure, you have dedicated CPU, dedicated memory space. One server, or as we call compartment, cannot communicate to another compartment without going through what we have a 40 gigabit coprocessor. That's where we have our hardware fire layer. That's where we have our application proxies. So if a compartment gets compromised, it's going to be contained to that one compartment. We're going to stop that lateral movement. So as I go into this server, I'm going to click right here on Active Directory. Now, as a firewall admin, I can tell you it takes about 40 firewall rules to lock down the communication between firewalls. You're talking about your RPC mapper ports, your Kerberos ports, LDAP, Global Catalog, your NetBIOS, your printer ports. So it takes several different ports and firewall rules to lock it down. With SkySecure, we come right here and create one policy, ADN. And if it edits that policy, all you have to do is give it what we call an entitlement. That's our policies. Give it an entitlement name, and then specify the domain. That's it. And then you click Save. Now what you see right here is the RPC mapper ports defined. What you don't see is behind the scenes we have the NetBIOS ports, the LDAP over SSL, the various ports, the Kerberos ports, all mapped out right there. So you only have this one line you have to do to protect ADN. Now if it's a server going out to 80, you just create one, simply the same thing, 80 out. All you have to do is define the domain name. Very simple. Then you could choose, do you want to allow RDP access? Okay, well here, in Microsoft's best practices, they use what's called a secure administrative workstation. So we've locked it down to that specific security administrative workstation, or you might know it as a jump server. And then we define, okay, we want to allow updates. So we define what we call our shield web out to say all the server can do is go out and get Microsoft updates. If we try to go to any other website, it's going to get blocked. Now what's great about this, the way this is architected, is this is not on the server. Traditionally you would do this via GPO, or maybe the Windows firewall, or if it's a Linux IP tables. Well, as you know, you run the risk of locking yourself out of that server. Or you get an admin on, it's like, well, I'm just going to bypass these settings and hack the registry if it's a Windows box and bypass it. Because this is wrapped around the OS, there is nothing installed on that server, whether it's an AD server or a server that's running a two-factor system on it, or a privileged account management, or an identity access management like your CyberArks or your SailPoints out there. It's all wrapped on the outside of the system where it can't be accessed. If I go look at the actual identity management server, I have right here called Win2K IdM. Same exact policies we've set up. We allow this one to do 80 Active Directory out, and then we've defined the rules of what's allowed to come in. In this case, on this example, I'm using Okta, and it has a desktop single sign-on. Now, Okta does a great job of securing their code, but here we're putting that extra level of code because if you put some of these companies out there do full on-premise platforms, and then you have to allow access to the internet. Other ones might have a desktop agent or agents around the server, but by default it's not listening on port 443. So with us, we can enforce anybody, whether it's internal or even on the internet, to talk to the server on TLS 1.2 and also make sure it negotiates a secure cryptographic protocol right there, even if that server is only listening on port 80. And then we allow, again, the Microsoft updates and what it's allowed to communicate out to, even if it's a cloud-based service. Now, maybe it's, like I mentioned, it could be a SailPoint or a CyberArk where it's completely just in communication. So what I want to do right now is I want to bring up a Windows desktop. I want to open up Google. So this desktop's joined to that domain that's protected, and I'm actually going to go to the cloud service out there. This cloud service is going to text, since I'm coming from the internal network, is going to redirect me to where that desktop single sign-on agent is. Now, if you notice, I was actually communicating on 443, but the desktop single sign-on agent is listening only on port 80. So we're enforcing that authentication. You're like, okay, well, what's that important? We can turn on and deploy certificates. Well, in this case, you might have one certificate. Instead of having to give it to each of your application administrators, you deploy it on SkySecure. You don't have to go to each and touch each individual server. You don't have to touch the IIS component. And here I'm just doing single sign-on, just showing Federation going all the way out through a Skyport system. And this desktop I'm actually connected to is also controlled by Skyport. So it limits to what I can get to. If I try to go to a normal website, I can't get.
Milton, let me just add, because I love what you did on the demo here. You showed how the components that are actually doing the access control for your users to the cloud services need to be locked down. They need to be locked down, and that's an enterprise component. If a hacker gets on your network and is going through the vulnerabilities, open ports, unpatched systems, blah, 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 or badly configured or escalated privileges, they can give themselves access to all your SaaS resources. Nice job there. Like that.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. An important part is, now how do you lock down these servers? A lot of times I know when I was a firewall admin, I was dealing with our applications group. I would ask them, what ports do you need? And they're like, well, I don't know. Let me try to contact the vendor and wait. With Skyport, we can help you immediately create that whitelist. So you can put a server, a virtual image on our server and lock everything inbound, outbound, and we will produce these reports right here and show you what that application is actually communicating to. What's it being blocked by our default policies? Which policies are actually allowing it outbound? So we create these quick whitelists for you and give you this immediate visibility. But what's also great, let's say you had a server that was hacked 9 months ago. 6 months ago, you retired that server, and today you discovered you were hacked. What can you do from a forensic standpoint? Most enterprises, not much they can do. With Skyport, we can go back to any point in time and choose. I can choose any month, any specific point in time about that server and say, show me what happened from this time to this time on that server. And run that report and see who communicated. Who did that server communicate to? Who actually changed the policy out there? So again, I can lock it down just simply dragging and dropping right here and choosing a specific point in time and seeing the communication that happened. So you always have that forensic accountability of your data. Now what we record, we're not recording the data, we're just recording the metadata, the network traffic, the in and out, what policy. If someone actually logged into SkySecure and changed the policy, we have that documented. But another thing is, you saw that I RDP'd into the client. Another important feature or functionality of SkySecure is we give you this secure remote console, graphical console, that doesn't allow, by the nature of RDP, that allows file sharing. With us, we can give you this graphical console that you can access it simply via the browser, and you connect to that server in a secure manner, but it does not allow any file transfer whatsoever.
And Milton, I think one of the things that's most interesting about this is if you start looking at what we talk about in terms of creating a first-class application, one of the biggest threat vectors that we're trying to protect against is if you can use the platform underneath your identity management systems or even Active Directory systems to actually authenticate yourself in, it's actually a way that you can escalate privilege. What's most interesting about the secure admin console here is that we're able to actually create a separate administration domain that just applies to your identity management. And this actually breaks the cycle that attackers are using in order to actually create this type of privilege escalation and this type of attack on identity itself. And in the end, this is what we can actually help solve. It's a lot of these platform concerns. How do you lock down the platform? And most importantly, how do you make it easy? How do you take half of those 288 pages from the Microsoft guide of locking down AD and make them happen easily or almost automatically? And that's really what we find. And as you were highlighting, Milton, the visibility is what keeps customers using the product and actually expanding the product. It's not just about locking it down, it's about getting the ability to now understand exactly what the system is doing. Now, Skyport can help deliver each one of these components, but this is effectively securing the substrate. There's also an architectural component to really being able to lock down these identity management systems. And this is why Skyport partners with companies like OSC that can actually help drive this architectural discussion. Garrett, do you want to cover a little bit about what OSC does for your customers and what a typical engagement looks like?
Yeah, I like that handoff there because Skyport is creating a systematic approach to infrastructure and deployment, where, like you said, there's 200-page documents on how to lock down and create, Milton, I've created STIGs, like for the federal government, what the procedure is, where you can quantify that and automate that in infrastructure. That's exactly what our OSC is doing at the application side, the application and the identity side. We're using our best practices that we've deployed these identity management systems. We've created our own SSO and Federation and navigated and configured and deployed other people's SSO Federation systems. We have written our own provisioning and used other third parties attestation and provisioning systems. This is what we'll do. We'll look at your enterprise, look at your identities, look at the resources, look at the regulatory channels, and come up with a complete plan on identity for your enterprise cloud partners and users. That's what we do, and we have the staff to do this, and that's our patents and certifications, et cetera.
Thanks for that, Garrett. And just for the folks who are joining us, just really want to thank you for tuning in to Demo Thursday this week. For more information about OSC, please visit their website directly, OSCGC. You can also get directly into contact with Garrett. Garrett, I really want to thank you for joining us. I know that I have learned significantly more about identity management over the last hour than I thought I would, so your insights here have been amazing. Milton, thank you very much for walking us through the Active Directory controls as well as the identity management controls inside of SkySecure. And if you'd like more information on Skyport, I encourage you to first visit our website. We can give you more information about our platform and how we can protect your critical identity management systems. What we generally tend to find is we are the most secure way of deploying any of these critical systems and upgrading these to first-class applications in your enterprise in order to actually allow you to comply with things like Sarbanes-Oxley and various NIST standards in terms of actually locking down these critical components. We also want to encourage you to join us again for additional Demo Thursday sessions. We will be diving into other topics as well. We can focus a little bit more on specifically protections that we can do for Active Directory. We'll have a session on that next week. And we also have other sessions that talk about how we can take the same types of technologies and help transparently lock down legacy applications and bring those directly into a compliance. But most importantly, if you like what you've heard here, we can actually prove this to you. Just as Milton was able to show you how simple and easy it is to apply these protections, we can prove this to you in your environment. We encourage you to get in touch with us so we can actually prove how we can directly improve the security posture of your identity management applications. And most importantly, when it's time to have an architectural look at identity management, you need to call in the experts. And that's one of the reasons I very much want to thank Garrett for joining us and walking us through really the architectural concerns about identity management and what OSC can provide. So Garrett, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any parting words before we close out the session?
No, it's a fantastic session, and this is a enterprise solution to secure infrastructure and secure deployment. All the best.
Thanks so much, Garrett. And if you'd like to talk more about identity management, we can also bring out our own identity management experts like Milton to actually have a discussion with you as well and to talk about specifically how Skyport can help you. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us on this Demo Thursday session and look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.
All the best.